one of the keys for me is when I approach any project, I have to figure out what I care about in this story. So that, because if I don't care about it, I can't make anybody else care about it.
This is Frank Schaeffer, and you are watching In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer today on Facebook Live and or on YouTube later or in some other place, or you are listening to this as a podcast. And my guest today is Dan Attias. And Dan has directed more TV shows than I care to even try to remember. I was going through his new book, which we will be talking about, and I told him jokingly a moment ago, it's much easier to list the top-rated golden age of television shows that he did not direct than the ones he worked on. We're talking about everything, and I'll get him to dive in on this. So Dan, I'm going to introduce you properly, but just to start here, and then we're going to talk about your book. So I don't get boring and just read a list out of your book. Just roll off some of the shows you have worked on as a director and impress the hell out of all our listeners today, because it's just a remarkable record of achievement.
Well, thank you. First of all, Frank, it's delightful to be here. And for your listeners, I consider Frank an old friend. We've known each other for many, many years, not real closely, but for many years. And I've enjoyed Frank's books and the stories of his son being one of the few upper middle class kids who agreed to enlist and defend the country in the military, and just wonderful stories and all of that. So it's a particular pleasure to be here talking with you, Frank. Yeah, my journey into episodic directing, it didn't start out to be my intention. My intention in the, I loved the independent films of the 1970s and considered myself, I wanted to be a feature film director. And my first job was a feature film. And it was like kind of television was not really regarded terribly highly. And at that time, this is like, say, in the mid 80s. And I started finding television work kind of as a placeholder until I could get that next feature. But lo and behold, I really kind of grew to love the medium, and maybe we can go into that in more detail. Sure, but I was around. I had done some shows when one of my favorite shows I did, which I don't think is kind of considered in that golden age, but just preceded it, and I think is of equivalent quality, was Northern Exposure. I did that.
I remember that.
Yeah, and I got friendly with David Chase, who then went on to create The Sopranos. And so David asked me to direct the first episode of The Sopranos after the pilot episode. He had done that, and it had been about 6 or 8 months before it went to series. So I did that. I couldn't, unfortunately, I had just taken a 2-year job as a producer director on a show called Party of Five. I don't know if your viewers would remember that. So I couldn't stay with The Sopranos, but I wound up, The Sopranos was really the first I'd consider great show I did. And I was fortunate to be able, since that time, to work on The Wire, on 6 Feet Under, on Deadwood, several HBO shows, Entourage later, Big Love, Treme. And I've stayed working throughout the time, and in more recent years, I've done The Americans and Homeland. Just a year or two ago, I did The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, and a show that actually, selecting shows is an interesting proposition, because you never really know how good they're going to be until you kind of in there and meet the showrunners, or they've had a track record. But one I took a flyer on a few years ago that's kind of developed quite a following is called The Boys, which is a kind of subversion of the superhero Marvel universe to kind of, and it's kind of an anti-corporate kind of view. So that was another one recently. So that's a smattering of some of the shows.
Yeah, so that's some of the stuff you've done. And of course, we'll get to the specifics. I want to introduce and talk about your book today, which is Directing Great Television. I think it's just getting published now. Here's the book. And Dan Attias has written a remarkable book on the art of directing, the politics of directing, the problems and opportunities of directing television. Now, I'm going to have to give a little preamble here, and I'm going to say 2 things about the book. First of all, I'm going to show you that I have dog-eared many, many sections of it. I did read this. I want you to see that, everybody. I am not a a person who interviews people and then wings it. I actually read their books, believe it or not, as an author. That's kind of a nice thing to do for somebody. Two things I want to say about the book. First of all, in the 1970s and 80s, as you know, Dan, I directed a lot of documentaries for my father, Francis Schaeffer, who was an evangelical leader. I later repented of what we were doing, which was propagating a kind of a false family values, right-wing misogyny, which I have grown long since beyond and tried to remedy with my writing and other things I've done. I then directed 4 very forgettable feature films in Hollywood, which I always refer to as kind of unwatchable late night television, but I know enough about the medium to be a pretty good reader of your book. And there's 2 things I think are really brilliant about the book. First of all, had I read Directing Great Television, though I was a feature film director 40 years ago, before I jumped in with a lot of overconfidence and stupidity because I had done some documentaries, I might have made passably decent films instead of completely forgettable ones. So that's point 1. There's a lot in here for anybody in any field of the arts, whether it's film or writing or television or just how to work with people. So that's the first thing I would say. I wish I had read this a long time ago. And the second thing that really surprised me, because I've been working on a new book that's coming out in November, which we're not going to be talking about because this is your show, but it has a lot to do with family values and relationships. What surprised me, and I'm going to start reading some of these quotes, is how much essential human wisdom is in your book, in the sense that if I was giving an entertaining, fun, good read to someone who was starting out in a relationship or a business or how to get on with other people, the strange thing is that aside from your skill as a television director, your humanity and what you have picked up along the way and the compassion and the decency that comes through here. And I'm not kidding you about this. If I was talking to a young couple who were having a problem with their relationship, whether gay or straight or non-binary or whomever, or somebody starting a new job at a company who wants to get on and succeed there, I would say, read Dan's book on television directing. Because everything in this book about how he directs and why he has succeeded is what you need in life to actually understand how to function with other people, especially in anything of a leadership or relationship role. So that's the part that surprises me. And I'm going to give you some examples of that, and then I'm going to let you respond to what I've been saying. When you look at this book and you go through, I'm just finding a quote that might be apropos of that. Good advice on life, page 6, and I'm going to read. The episodic director often labors in obscurity, usually unrecognized for the creative contributions she has made. But to do the best job you're capable of, you must take responsibility for the story taking, making the words on the page come alive. You must accept all of the sometimes onerous limitations, forswear too much whining about setbacks, even those for which you might not have been responsible, and be okay with not getting the ego strokes you'll probably feel you deserve for a job well done. But when you do pull it off and create something beautiful and entertaining, it's a fantastic feeling. In my experience, it does not happen without frustration, roadblocks, fear of failure, and confronting all of one's own insecurities and self-doubts. The best way, though, through for me is to recognize that the master we serve is not our ego, but the story, for we have an opportunity to connect meaningfully with those viewers who will accompany us on the journey of the tale. And I just want to say as a writer that if I'm talking to a young writer again someday, I'm going to say, if you want to know how to write a good book, what Dan says about TV directing, not serving the ego, but the story, this is the book, this is the advice. And the same goes for a relationship, whether at work or a romantic relationship. So I just want to tell you, I think you've written a wise book, which is also a really good how-to for anybody who wants to get into film or television. But I also think it's a really wise book. So it's odd because I wasn't expecting that. Not that I know you well enough for enough years to know that you're a wise person, but I wasn't expecting the book to have as much wisdom in it that would apply across life. So with that long, crazy preamble, I want you to tell me how you think of the book, because I see it as a I see it as a wise book that also is about television directing.
Well, I'm very moved and appreciative of what you're saying. Frank, I've also had the pleasure of being able to read your new book that's coming out in November, which I think is also a wise book. And like you, and I consider myself, something of a seeker. I mean, why are we here? My life is my one chance at kind of getting to know who I really am, to plumb the depths of my own soul, remember, whatever it was we forgot when we came in that we were brought here to do and how to be. And, I'm not right. I wasn't writing a proselytizing book or anything like that. I was sharing my approach to directing. And it's been very interesting because the motivation for writing really started with the fact that I've, in the last decade or so, really started mentoring some young directors. And as a result of doing that, I had to kind of deconstruct my process. It's like to say how and I say in the preface, it's not a how-to book, because really, people who are looking for that are really looking in the wrong place. It's like, it's really the only how is how to connect to yourself. And you're going to be the best director. And I think to extend to the areas you mentioned in life, we can be the best person if we really are examining how we feel about things, how something affects us. And that's kind of, if there's an overarching lesson for directors, I hope, is to say, always rely on your own sense of things. It's like, yes, there's going to be and I detail several, but there's things you have to learn. It's like, I think it was in Zen and the Art of Archery, the discussion of like, well, there's a lot of technical stuff you've got to try to practice, but then at a certain point, you've got to let go of it. And you've got to it's got to become a part of you so that you can come from your full, deepest nature. And that's kind of what I think is the goal. So, I was writing, I had mentored several young directors.
One of them wrote an afterword for your book.
Yes, she did.
Thanks you. And thanks you for giving opportunities to people, but also for helping break the barriers of misogyny and other things in Hollywood and bring in young directors from non-traditional directing backgrounds. One of them writes an afterword in your book.
Thank you. Maybe I can share the story about Steph in particular, a very talented young woman that I really wanted to help. Maybe we can get into that, but the impulse was, if I can't work one-on-one with someone, can I share some of these experiences? So I really wanted to write, whatever I might impart to someone coming up. And what it evolved into, I realized I'm not a writer like yourself. I mean, I was an English major and I love literature, and I as a youth aspired to be a writer, but I'm not great with a blank page, and there's a lot of things I'm not. And so I approached this, not really sure where it was gonna lead. And I found that I didn't want to give a laundry list of things to do. I didn't want to make it a how-to book. I wanted to illustrate certain teaching points. And I found that really the best way for me to do it was to share my process, was to tell stories. And there are a lot of stories in it, only a few of which are not mine directly. Almost all of them are my own experiences, because that's what I wanted to share with the reader.
Yes.
It's like, okay, here was my situation. I came into this show and the script, offered me this, but it didn't really answer, a key storytelling issue.
Or you give an example, for instance, one story that I enjoyed in there because it's just rings so true. That is, the showrunner was giving notes directly to the actor, with you sitting there, and you're the director. And of course, this breaks all the protocol, but you handled it very well. And you went up and talked to this person, who then apologized in a kind and humane way to you. And then after that, didn't do it again, and then rehired you for more work on the same show, or perhaps it was another show. I forget the instance, but I think it was more episodes of the same show.
It was.
And I thought that, that's a real tribute to you, because it's hard to call somebody on something and wind up, still being friends. It's something I know that I've bungled sometimes, and, you have a good touch there.
Well, as have I. I didn't write about the ones I bungled. I did include a few that I bungled, because I thought that was really important to talk about. It's not a seamless journey. It's going to, You know, you have to expect that there's going to be a learning curve and you're going to make mistakes.
Just so people understand here a little bit, this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. I'm talking to Dan Attias, that I don't think it's an exaggeration to say is one of America's top television directors. You only have to look at everything he's done from The Sopranos to Deadwood. Happened also coincide with many of my favorite shows. Jeannie and me, you know, because we're fond of you and know you, and always have fun when we're watching something we haven't seen before, and then your name pops up. It's like, wow, Dan did this one too. You know, whether it's 6 Feet Under or Deadwood or whatever, I always love to see your name pop up. The other thing that I want people to know about you, and we're going to keep talking about the book, is your political involvement. I remember going to an event with you that Sean Penn was speaking at, and these are all friends of yours and people you know. So let's bring that angle in and then keep talking about the book. You are someone who is quite progressive, quite politically involved, knows people who do things. You want to just talk about that a minute, and then we'll get back to the book.
Well, first, let me just make it clear. I'm not friends with Sean Penn. I don't know Sean Penn. I think we went to an event where
we were sitting at a table a little while in front of him, and, you know, being out of towner, I assume, hey, you know, you know all these famous. Hey, you know a lot of other people. Okay, so he must be one of the few actors you haven't worked with.
I have been fortunate to work with a great many outstanding actors. My wife and I are both, you know, we haven't ever really kind of pursued the whole social scene of Hollywood.
Right.
We're pretty reclusive ourselves.
Yeah.
But we do have strong, you know, leanings towards progressive politics and the overworked, you know, phrase of social justice.
Yeah.
Which I always cringe a bit when words lose their meaning because they're so overused.
Sure.
And not really hearing what the meaning is of each individual word. But yes, we've been supportive of several progressive organizations and
help women directors and others who have traditionally been shut out of the business to advance. I know you've done that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll maybe this is time to share the story about Steph, because it was an interesting story. She is a young woman who approached me. She's now probably mid-30s, but she was part of the studios in Hollywood have now what they call kind of diversity inclusion workshops.
Sure.
And this was one where they were placing young directors in the position of being able to shadow a working director on a show. And Steph called me up. She was not part of my original mentoring group. I didn't know her. But she called me up. I was about to direct an episode of The Americans. This was, I think, 5 or 6 years ago. And she said, "This is my favorite show. I'm in this program. They could place me. Is it possible I could shadow you?" And I said, well, as I do with anybody who wants to do that, I wanted to meet her. I wanted to sit down and have a cup of coffee and get a sense of the person. And I liked her very much. And she again was like the 3 or 4 others I had formed this group around. She had been at it for several years. She was approaching 30 if she wasn't already. She had made a couple of really nice films. She's from San Francisco, but she had been living in Ireland, and she had made a short film that got an Academy Award nomination. And she'd actually made a very touching independent feature, an Irish feature. And but she couldn't get arrested in television because, particularly at that time, she was right at the cusp when it started to shift. There was, you know, it wasn't just being a woman that was difficult to get hired, or being a person of color. It was also the fact that, you know, getting a job, it's very hard for anybody to break into episodic directing, because unlike features, most people who break in, including myself, get a feature for their first job because there's a lot more support. There's no real urgent time frame for it. Mm-hmm. You can reshoot if things don't go right. You can delay release. Television schedules are rigid and unforgiving, and you have to make 1,000 decisions quickly, and they have to be right, because if they're not, it's going to be very costly. Yeah. Reshoot is very difficult. It can upend a whole season. So it's understandable in a certain sense that directors, you know, that producers are reluctant to hire first timers. Mm-hmm. But I liked her a lot. And I said, sure, you can shadow me on this show. So she was with me, and we had a great time. And then during the course of that, I watched her film. It was for your viewers, if they're interested. It was called Run and Jump. And it starred a guy who's known mainly for comedy directing and for comedy acting. I'm killing myself. I can't remember his name.
Never mind.
Know him, but it was a wonderful human interest story. So I knew she was talented. Mm-hmm. And I really enjoyed her, and she was great. 6 months later, I called her up. I said, what's going on? I mean, you're directing now, right? Because you're so good. She said, oh, well, now I'm in the Warner Brothers internship program. I'm trying to shadow someone else. And my heart always sinks when I hear that, because people don't get hired because they shadowed somebody.
Right.
That doesn't happen, And I said, that's ridiculous. Isn't your agent helping you? And she said, no, well, and so I said, you know what, I'm going to, so I happened to call the Americans, and I said I was scheduled to do another show for them. And I think I had actually called them before, and I had an opening occurred in my schedule, and I had called them and said, I have this opening. I know I'm going to do a show later in the season, but I have an opening. If you have another one, I'd love to do it. I love the show. And they said, oh, we'd love to hire you, but we have to hire a minority. We're trying to hire a woman if we can, or a person of color. And I said, well, here's an idea. Why don't you hire Steph? She's fantastic. And you met her last year. She shadowed me. And they said, oh, has she ever directed an episode of television? And I said, no. And she said, oh, well, we'll never get her approved. And something just kind of shifted in me. I just thought, this is crazy. Even though as I say, I do understand the reluctance. Mm-hmm. So I just said, how about if you hire Steph, I'll be with her. I'll be with her from all the way prep through shooting, and I'll guarantee that she won't miss a story point, and I'll backstop her. She won't go over budget. And then I threw in the thing, and you don't have to pay me. Because I knew they didn't have budget to pay 2 directors for a show. And I also knew, by the way, I couldn't come off as the director. This was all background work. Yeah. And they were kind of flabbergasted, and they said, oh, yes, please. So we did it. They shifted things around, though. They didn't just say she could do it. She said, well, we're going to have you direct again. She'll watch you one more time, and then you go into hers. So we did it. And it was a marvelous experience for her. And I'm so gratified. She was telling me at the time, I had no idea where this was going to go. I certainly didn't imagine I would be telling this story on a podcast, but she said, Stan, it's so nice of you doing this and not getting paid. I said, look, my pay is going to be if you have a great career. Yeah. And I'm so happy that she has.
So what has she done since?
She has, well, a few shows your audience might know about. She got an Emmy nomination for the show The Watchmen.
Yep.
She is currently doing The Mandalorian, this huge Lucasfilm thing. She did The Deuce for HBO, which was David Simon's show after The Wire, Treme. She did The Americans twice. They hired her back again. Good. She did Billions also. She's done, so she's off and running. And it's so wonderful. Yeah, it's
good for you. And listen, you know what? I'm going to just get back into the book now here, because I love that story. And for folks watching this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. It's also a podcast. I'm talking to Dan Attias today, who is a fabulous human being, but also has written this great book, Directing Great Television, Inside TV's New Golden Age. And I read it because I have been a movie director of documentaries and features. And so I read it knowing what I'm reading. But the thing that really jumped out at me, as I said to Dan at the beginning of this program, is that there is so much in this book which leaps off the page to me as being applicable to anything in the arts, whether you're writing a novel or making a movie, and even more so to human relationships. And I'm just going to go now to a quote I like that starts on page 55 in the chapter, "What story are you telling?" Storytelling itself is as old as the human species. Stories are revered in every culture. People have huddled around fires to hear tales and gathered to watch dramas for longer than recorded history, because there is a hunger for stories deep within our psyches. Stories are fundamental to the meaning we ascribe to the world and to who we take ourselves to be. We are so driven by narrative and the need for coherence in our lives that most people would rather live out a bad story than face the void of having no story at all. Wow, I think that is, by the way, you say you're not a writer. That's crazy, because that's a brilliant line. I'm going to read that again. We are so driven by narrative and the need for coherence in our lives that most people would rather live out a bad story than face the void of having no story at all. All of us live in a story. Some of us are aware of the stories we tell ourselves and are aware they are stories. Others assume their story is reality. This is really good stuff, by the way. We develop a narrative about our lives, usually based on past experiences, and cling to it, even if it defines us as deficient, rejected, or needing to be rescued by someone else. Some are fortunate to have empowering stories that define them as capable and ready for a challenge. But regardless of story merits, we inhabit them to feel secure in knowing who we are, or to think we know who we are, even if that story leads to pain and suffering for ourselves or for others. Among the most powerful ways to affect people is to invite them to reconsider the stories with which they've identified. I just think, that paragraph is, first of all, worth the price of the book. But Dan, when you get sick of TV directing, I think you start a second career as a philosopher and life coach, because this is really good stuff. And
well, I'm so happy you point that. Yeah, Frank, I'm so happy you point that out, because I've actually thought that is the next subject for me to explore.
It's such a beautiful way you've put it, and it's so true to my own life. I've gotten to an age, I'm pushing 70 now, and I think a lot about the past and so forth. I was telling my granddaughter Amanda, driving down to a music conference I was speaking at, actually first thing I've done since COVID happened, out in the woods. And I was telling her, one of the advantages of getting to a little older is that when you're younger, you worry about the future. But most of my story is past. So good or bad, I know how the story ends now. So I no longer have that anxiety of youth of saying, where will this go? And I just think your writing in this book, Directing Great Television, is I just hope people who are watching this understand that this is a really terrific book. I don't care whether you're never going to direct an episode of television. If you want to know how to live and just make anything and get on with other people while you're doing, I'd urge you to get the book. But anyway, Dan, what is this philosophical strain that's running through this book? Because there's so much more.
Yeah, there's a lot that underpins, right? A lot of it underpins kind of my whole journey. And I'm so happy you're bringing this up, because I doubt if any of the other podcasts I'm going to try to get on to promote the book are going to talk about this. And it's the most important thing to me about it. I mean, I wouldn't want your audience to think it's pure philosophy. There's a lot of real interesting stories.
Hey, if you want to be a good TV director or a movie director, read the book. But I just think for every one person who will read this book as that, there are 100 others who would read it just as a great book.
Thank you so much. Well, let me share, try to talk about how all these things you bring up are related to television directing or creativity and why I felt the need to talk about it. Because I mean, one of the things I hope I make clear in the book is, for me to direct a show well, first of all, the director is the storyteller. And I think anybody who works on a film or TV show should consider themselves storytellers, no matter what their job is, because every choice, every decision should be around that subject. But the thing that I think people often miss is it's not clear what the story is. It's like they think, oh, here's a script, let's just film. A lot of arrogant producers will say, yeah, just film the script. Is this, well, you can't film the script. I think I say in there, it's filming the script would be pictures of words on a page. The director has to flesh it out, make it come alive. And one of the keys for me is when I approach any project, I have to figure out what I care about in this story, because if I don't care about it, I can't make anybody else care about it. And that goes to diving deep below the surface into what is the subtext, what's really happening. Why does one love story land for an audience whereas another doesn't? I mean, the same things happen, because I think it's because something is going on subterraneanly. Something is, and often not, it can be the case that even the writers of the episode don't know really what they were writing about. They were probably connected to something deep, but they might not have kind of defined it for themselves. I have to be able to define it for myself, because I'm going to have to be directing the actors, have to be monitoring each moment. And it has to kind of go towards this gestalt of what I'm really trying to say. And this leads to, the importance of, it's like how you define story. Like I tell a story, for example, about an episode of Homeland that was a particular challenge for me, because the producers wanted a certain transition to happen in the life of Carrie Mathis and Claire Danes, and I didn't think it was justified. I didn't think they had done enough work to make it really. They wanted it to happen. One of my favorite lines, I don't know if I can quote it exactly. I said, in a story, you can want something to happen, certain things to happen. You can say that they happen. You can provide as many reasons as possible to justify why they happen, but that's not the same thing as creating the felt sense that they actually have happened.
Yeah, good point.
And and you've got to, and that's what I so love about directing. Is I feel in many ways I come most alive there because I'm very present to what's happening, and I get to monitor myself. I have to really say, am I moved? What's happening within me? Whereas in my life, a lot of the time I'm living out a story that I haven't.
Yeah, and you don't know the ending of it there.
Right, and I'm presenting a persona. I want to be perceived a certain way. So I'm out of touch more often than I am when I'm just simply trying to serve the story. And in that instance, I don't think I said it in the chapter, but afterwards I thought it would have been a good place to drive this point home. It's like the story wasn't about what they were purporting was a story, and it was giving me so much trouble trying to justify. I redefined the story. I said the story is really about not what's happening between Carrie and her daughter, but it's happening between Carrie and her adversary. And it's really, the story is about them coming together. And by redefining the story, then I could care about it because it is something true and deep. And I think that's kind of, I'm kind of meandering, I think, from your question, but I think for me personally, I think for all of us, really, we're living out stories unconsciously when we're suffering. Like that can lead to suffering, and to really, and I was moved. One of the things I'll just share with you, Frank, moved me in your book, is you've made quite a journey from where you started, and in some important ways, I don't think it's inaccurate. I think you actually say it, that a lot of what you're doing now is a kind of penance for what you feel guilt about for having contributed to in the early days of evangelism. And I was very touched and thought again about the tenacity with which these stories grab hold of us, because I was noticing how I was surprised I shouldn't have been, but how you still struggle with these things. I think you were writing about Christmas and, all these things that I thought I purged myself of about, from my early upbringing. No, they really have a hold on me, and I act out in a way, and I want everybody to and it's so interesting to me because we get so affected by these stories through which we identify ourselves, that give us safety, that give us a sense of belonging, and it's very challenging to really plumb their depths and get to the point where we can maybe jettison them. Because I'll tell you, for me, real enlightenment is when you don't need stories, when you're just present. When you're just affected by the wonder, like you write, of your grandchildren, or and to me, that's the great story to get told. And the stories, in certain sense, are like, to get a little highfalutin. It's like I think there's a Zen story. It's like your boat. You take a boat to get to the other side of the other shore, and then you have to burn the boat. Yeah, it's like a finger pointing at the moon is not the moon, but it's a pointer. And it's like, to me, story is like that. To me, it's like we're living out stories that are taking us away from who we really are. And it's absolutely an evolutionary requirement. It's the way it's supposed to be. We're supposed to think of ourselves in terms of a narrative, but at a certain point, to be fully present, I think we have to be willing to see that, to that point I made, you quote, to see that the stories through which we define ourselves are not reality, they are stories.
And I just think that is so essential, because as we get older too, we sort of retell ourselves stories, and I think sometimes in our own mind do not know how to really judge them as part of the reality that we've lived, because now they've gone back into this place of story that defines you. I love your point of saying, at some point you don't need the stories, you just need the reality of the moment. Let me just remind people, I'm talking to Dan Attias, who is one of the foremost television directors alive today, and literally has been part of the golden age of television from the Sopranos forward. Directing Great Television is the book, and as I've been saying, it's far more than a book about directing. Now, to get to some of the directing points in the book, I don't know whether you have a talent for turning down bad jobs or have just been very lucky, or a little of both, because I don't quite understand how you wound up being in all the not only all the best television out there, but happens, whether it's The Fabulous Mrs. Maisel or The Sopranos or Deadwood, to be part of projects that I rewatch. I don't rewatch or reread very many books, and maybe I'm giving away too much about my own personal taste here, but I've I have rewatched the whole series of The Sopranos maybe 3 times. I've done the same for Deadwood maybe 4 times. I love The Fabulous Mrs. Maisel. I discovered 6 Feet Under when it was happening and just thought, I'm never going to like this, and then was drawn in. Have you turned down a lot of stuff, or do you just pick good ones?
Well, I you know, it in a certain, in some ways it is a crapshoot. You know, there's so much you don't know about something.
Yeah.
I have had shows that didn't work out that, you know,
Yeah.
but I am drawn to shows that, you know, first you start a career and you're just trying to get hired on anything.
Yeah, sure, of course, we know about
But as I got established and I could have more, I am very drawn, and I'm very tenacious about pursuing shows that feel to me like they really are dealing with something that really says something about what it is to be a human being.
Yeah.
And it's like, I'm excited by that, not just because I mean, if only for the fact that it speaks to what's missing in me. It's like, I want to be a part of that. I want to, because it's like what excites me about being an episodic director as opposed to a feature director, which is more thing in itself, is I like inhabiting different worlds. I love it when I see a show that I don't see things that way. I don't, but it seems compelling and real. And it's like somebody, those people behind the show are connected to something I'm not yet connected to, but there's something that speaks to me in a deep way. And I want to get involved, because when I direct, I have to so immerse myself in that sensibility, in that show, in that, you know, the tone, all those things I have to, because directing really is I think of it sometimes as learning a language so that I can speak it in my voice. Not to mimic it. Then it's kind of like, okay, that's a kind of lifeless version of the show. I'm trying to really fully discover, what is it like to see that way? Even it goes to the visual language. You know, it's like shows are very distinct in the way they frame and what lenses they use, and that's the way you see. And it's so I'm generally not interested in something. Oh yeah, I know that. You know, it's like, it's a world so I like to move around, and so I've been fortunate. I've been guided by what I find intriguing, and
it interests me, you know, what you're saying, because of course that from the viewer's point of view, from my point of view, or as a viewer, or a reader, or a listener to art and various expressions, you always want it to take you somewhere else too. So you don't want to watch an opera about your own life. I mean, we're here too much. And of course, what would be the things that link Deadwood, The Fabulous Mrs. Maisel, The Sopranos? These are lives I haven't lived.
Right.
Sort of in the extreme. Speaking of Deadwood, you know, I was one of the many fans who was disappointed when the 3rd season did not come along. And it just ended.
Yeah, I know.
And it was a kind of a quirky experience. But one thing I always like when I'm watching a show that you've directed is a couple episodes later to see your name pop up again. And, you know, they liked you, they kept hiring you, and, you know, you became part of the whole project. And I think one thing that your book talks about very well is the relationship between the showrunner, the writer, and the director in directing television, which is, you know, somewhat unique to that medium. It doesn't repeat in theater or in opera or in film. So a television director has all the obligations and responsibilities of a movie director, in addition to which he or she has to deal with another set of people besides a producer.
In addition to which, you're really serving someone else's vision. You're coming in, you're not coming in, this is my vision, I'm going to do this. No. And to me, I find that really a kind of fascinating spiritual exercise, because
I was going to say that. You took the words out. I was going to say there's a kind of monastic humility that goes with this role, which is absent in the prima donna kind of roles of Hollywood.
Exactly. And it defeats, you know, it's funny, I had a father who was kind of a rageaholic, very self-aggrandizing and all that. So I have I probably shut down some of my own impulse towards aggrandizement. And so I have to be careful of that, not to kind of have a closet experience of it. But, you know, I like the fact, even though it can be frustrating, I like the fact that I'm not doing it. I know at the end of the day, very few people remember whoever directed a particular episode of the show. You know, it's the it's the people who created the show, and they're the showrunners, they're the stars, and rightfully, because they're doing, you know, they're doing so much of the work. But what I also love is, and I'm fascinated by, and this also goes to a kind of spiritual notion, I think, is, you know, who, and I have a couple of chapters, you may well recall them, where it's like, I came up with solutions to problems that, it would be easy to kind of claim credit. Oh, I figured that out. But it's like, what I had to really acknowledge was that there's two in particular. One was an episode of The Americans and one was an episode of Homeland.
Yeah.
And I found in both, and I was frustrated because I couldn't get a rewrite I wanted. And it's like, a lot of people will throw out there, oh, well, these guys don't know anything. I know better.
Yeah.
No, it's like, okay, you got to say yes to this. It's like, this is what it is. It's like, I'm here to do a job.
Yeah.
And I wound up, I think, again, by really being committed to telling something deep and truthful, finding the truth of something that maybe eluded you, and really, I've not always been successful by any means, but in these two instances anyway, I write about it, I felt I was. But what was fascinating to me is both solutions I came up with resulted from me really spending time with the script, the particular scene in each of these instances, and really just focusing on it and doing a kind of inquiry. It's like, what is not working for me here? What bumps, what would interest me? What detail is bothering me? And it's like, it leads to an exploration. And I came up with these solutions. But what was interesting is I wouldn't have come up with the solutions if the scripts themselves hadn't been written exactly the way they were. So I appreciated that the writers, did not consciously come forward with what I kind of interpreted finally. But I'm convinced that at some level in their psyche, they were operating on that there's something percolating below that wants to be birthed. And, we all come with our different vantages, our different vantage points and points of view and experiences. We all bring our creativity to it. That's what's great about filmmaking. And, it's like, there's so many people who touch it. It's almost like an oral tradition. It's like, with stories that get handed down through thousands, generation after generation, like the Grimm's tales or the oral tradition. I'm not talking about like Hans Christian Andersen who wrote fairy tales. I'm talking about the ones that have been, thousands of years of hand one generation or another. There's something archetypal about that. It's beyond individual. And is in some funny way, there's something similar about all the hands that are on a TV show. And these relationships, the writer and the director and the actors, of course, who interpret it, we're all kind of, and the director's role is to hold the vision. That's important, because people will come up with solutions. An actor will come up with 10 ideas maybe. And your job as a director is to say, but which is feeding the story? Which is taking us away from it? So anyway.
Something that interests me about what you're saying and that I felt in the book, and by the way, talking to Dan Attias, and this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer podcast and live on Facebook and so forth, directing great television. And as I've said, this book has so much life wisdom in it that I hope a lot of people read it besides those who are going to direct television. But you better read it if you're going to direct television, because as someone who has directed, this is really a great book on how to be a good director. But one of the things, Dan, it occurs to me when I look at art history, whether it's Bach composing for various courts in Germany, forced to compromise because some idiot hires him, Beethoven going deaf, Lorenzo de' Medici backing art and nurturing these talents. I think one of the things we've lost in the modern era when it comes to producing art, and certainly this applies to film, very much so. And I think why so few directors have more than one or two really great films in them, surprisingly so, or rock bands fade away so quickly, is that this idea of the author of something and the ego that goes with that. There's something about a collaborative effort. For instance, I'll give you an example from my own life. Because you can self-publish now, I wouldn't have to go to a publisher, but I would miss the editorial criticism of my work from a pro. Like my new book's coming out, and I've had a wonderful woman. She's 60 or so, and she has life wisdom, and she asked me to rewrite sections. God forbid I just got to do anything I wanted. And I always think that some of the greatest art in history has been produced on commission, and the artist finding the solution to prepare herself or himself to meet the conditions of the commission and make it their own within that framework produces something better than an unlimited budget and total freedom. Every time. And so when you look at all the church art that came out, and it's just one Madonna after another, whatever, sure, they were within the confines of the church's commission. They also produced some of the greatest art there's ever been. And the same with music and commissioned pieces. And I think that one of the reasons television entered its golden age is it forced a level of collaboration absent in so much, excuse me, but sort of bullshit ego film trips where you have a couple good movies and then it's just total crap from there on out because the person's given the budget and the freedom to do what they want, God forbid, without the director, showrunner, writer, producer, budget constraints. I even think you produce better work because you're in an 8 to 10 week time frame and nobody does give you a year and a half to mess around and make
and there's an additional situation you have to accept as well, not just the ones you accurately cite. And that is like when you create a television show, it has to be able to go on potentially for 5 or 8 years.
Right.
You're going to have to, your idea is going to be not exactly constrained, but limited, bordered by concerns that like, okay, what is going to be generative? What is going to, it's like we have to create a situation that is going to speak to us in a way that we're, so you can't just, again, like you say, do anything you want and be unlimited. You're hemmed in by various things. Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, that's frankly, that's one of the things I enjoy about coming into an existing franchise, an existing show, because for whatever, I mean, I really admire people who do pilots and stuff like that. I've never enjoyed it. I've done it 3 or 4 times and I haven't enjoyed it, partly because the networks, everybody gets in some ways more, anxious and all over you. But also because, frankly, truthfully, I don't do well with a blank page. It's like, and that's the opposite of what you're saying. The kind of the indulgent one who just wants to just do anything. Sure. I have kind of another spin on that, and maybe it's the other side of the same coin. But I love coming into a situation that is limited, that has defined. Okay, this is the way we see things. This is the sensibility of this show. This is the cast you're going to have. This is we do cast again too. Sure. But it's like, to me, it's like, okay, what's the given? Okay, there's that. And then that frees me up to kind of really explore something. I feel safe in a certain sense. Because maybe it's a fear of really revealing something I don't want to know about myself if I had a blank page, and I don't know if I want to, I don't know what it is. I've spent a lot of time thinking about it. And I mean, early on, I'm grateful that it became a golden age of television, because when I started doing it, I was punishing myself. No, I'm not doing features. I'm not really a director. I'm not, but what this has afforded is like me to explore depths I don't think I ever would have been able to.
Well, and the thing is, there's a comparable thing. And that is, if you look at the paintings of John Singer Sargent, there was a generation of people that came right after him who began to reject him because he, quote, only painted people's portraits. He would agree to paint a portrait. Now everybody realizes that John Singer Sargent is one of the great painters, but he worked within the constraint of a commission. And there was a period in the late 19th century, early 20th century that sort of ends with American Expressionism and people like Andy Warhol, that somehow originality as a solo project was what it's all about. But what's interesting is today, a lot of the younger people are coming back to more collaborative forms in art and in writing. I think that 100 years of egomaniacal self-expression with no constraint has produced so much crap on so many levels. I'm not saying all crap, but a lot, that there's a lot of people who actually long for the kind of the constraints, so that within that you can really shine and do your job, and the collaborative effort that you do. And so, when I look at the episodes you've directed on these shows, these obviously, this whole collaborative thing works. And I just want to talk about this, in terms of one of your how-to bits, but also that applies to a wider thing. Speaking of collaboration, as I like to do when rehearsing complicated sequences, I started by restating the scene's historical antecedents to remind the cast of how their characters arrived at this precise moment, reacquainting them with story points they may have forgotten that ought to influence their choices. I love that, but I also think there's a wider application, and that is being able to root any story in history. So I want to ask you a question, and it's not rhetorical. It seems to me the TV shows that last best, and the books for that matter, or movies, are ones that are either set in the past or set in the future. The present is the hardest to trick because right now, 10 seconds from now isn't right now. And so it's instantly dated because you're trying to be of the moment, which dates it instantly. Whereas if you're doing something like, say, Deadwood, you're bringing a freshness of a sort of a Shakespearean aura to the writing, which worked very well with, I think it was Ian McShane, wasn't it? And the others, you know, mixing so much profanity with also a Shakespearean type of language. You're not looking at this and judging it by the present. Hey, you're not looking and saying, oh, wow, that was last year's cell phone. This thing must have been made in 2010 because it was a flip phone or something. If you're doing it into the future and it's alien, you know, you're saying, well, that was their interpretation of the future. How do you feel about that stuff?
I don't know. I don't know. I think
6 Feet Under was kind of in the present tense, wasn't it?
There's been a lot of great shows in the present tense. So
yeah, and they work okay. So let me flip the question.
Yeah.
Why is it the shows that you worked on in the present tense, like 6 Feet Under, work so well, whereas some of them feel instantly dated? Why does it feel like it's forever?
I think the vision that is first articulated generally by the showrunner, the person who created it.
Yeah.
It's something that's alive within them as an exploration that it's very important to them to kind of delve into it and discover, why is this important to me?
Yeah.
It's like in 6 Feet Under, you know, I'm not sure of all the reasons, but Alan Ball, he lost his sister in a car when he was like 12 or 14. His sister died in an automobile crash.
Yeah.
So the whole idea of what is the meaning of death, and growing up in a culture that denies death, it just puts it off to the side, that it's like, you know, that was what was kind of revolutionary about the show. But no, it put it front and center. We're having opening credits are about a grave going into it. And the first scene in every show was going to be see somebody die.
Yeah.
And then the people who are the grieving survivors are going to come into the funeral home and talk about it.
Yeah.
You know, so it's like right there. And then the visual style, which was brilliant. And it's like a lot of static, still frames. It's like, we're not getting away from this.
No.
Let's just sit here with this.
Yeah, we're going to embalm somebody now. And we're going to just sit there with it.
So I'm sure this would not have come from him had he not had a real personal wound from it, and a desire not just to revel in a wound, but to really integrate it, understand it. Why did this happen? Wow. How can I think of this way? David Chase writing The Sopranos, another contemporary show.
Yeah.
Now he grew up in Jersey. He grew up around these wise guys. He wasn't a wise guy.
Yeah.
But I can't tell you all the antecedents that pointed him to this, but I will tell you this, his mother was the model for Livia, who was the most sociopathic personality. And one of the great sadnesses about that show is Nancy Marchand died in the middle of the second season.
Yeah.
And I was fortunate, having done worked on the first season, had a great episode with her when she's being, you know, when Tony has to put her in the old folks home. But this was a uniquely just horrific human character. And Chase had her as his mother. So there was a lot of Tony Soprano in David Chase. And sort of developing those kind of, it's like, I'm sure that fed him, you know, how do I make sense of this? You know, my demons that are just rattling around all the time. So that's, again, something deeply personal, not to mention whatever he noticed growing up. So I think you have to have a showrunner who is an explorer and is really trying to, I mean, to me, this isn't true of everybody. I mean, but I know for me, what's exciting to me and what is kind of tells me when I've got there is when I finally feel I've uncovered something that's true. When characters have really formed. I mean, I wrote about this in the chapter on the Homeland. I wrote about this, that there's something about the most moving moments to me are the moments of a character having a personal reckoning, having to face something either that they weren't aware of or they've been strenuously avoiding. You know, and because that's what courage is. And that's what we spend so much time in our lives, me included, like running unconsciously. We wouldn't even necessarily be able, what am I running from? Why am I so anxious that these situations come up? You know, why is it so important to me, this? And the great moments of drama for me are when characters, I want to tell a story if I can. It's in the book, not from something I did, but I love this story. And but the great moments for me is when, we got to it, something has been revealed. Characters have to face, they have to give up the ghost. I'm not going to do that anymore. And there's usually great sacrifice, loss. They're finally willing to experience often the pain they've been running from and to see if they can survive it. Sometimes they can't, but usually they can. It's just because usually we're much stronger than we ever give ourselves credit for. And that's the drama of being alive, right?
Yeah.
So this is what I'm drawn to. That's me. That's what I'm bringing to the.
Yeah, and I think actually a lot of that comes out in the book. Let me just, we're winding down a little bit here, but there's, and I know you have a story there.
That's all right. I can.
But I want to read this, and then I'm going to ask you to finish this up by telling your story.
Okay.
Besides being, in a real sense, your boss, showrunners, that's the people who invent the show and guide it, along with the writers, are also subject to the same frustration and imperfect behavior we all are. It's helpful to keep in mind the considerable pressure on them, even while you're coping with your own stress. Ideally, you can find support from your showrunner. And if any of them are reading this, I suggest that a well-timed compliment can do wonders for your director's spirits. But this often doesn't happen. Showrunners may be too busy putting out fires or preparing other scripts. They may be unsure whether you are delivering the episode they are hoping for, one on which their job security may depend. Now, I just want to finish up by saying, Directing Great Television by Dan Attias, who is one of television's great directors, if I may be a little corny there, is not only worth the price if you're thinking of doing anything related to theater, drama, directing. If you want to act, read this book by a director who knows how to get great performances out of actors. And I'm not being flippant here as an old guy who's been married a long time. If you'd like your marriage to work, why don't you read Dan's book and figure out how to work with other people, including the passage I just read about working with showrunners, and it wouldn't hurt for them to compliment the director once in a while. That applies to every single relationship. By the way, my producer, Ernie, thank you again. You are such a great human being to make all this happen in terms of compliments. So this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. I'm with director of film and television, Dan Attias. And I want you, Dan, we have 5 minutes left here. Tell me the story you wanted to tell. And,
well, I don't know.
No, it'll be a good way to end it. Let's have a story.
Well, okay. This is one of the few stories in the book that is not mine personally, although I saw it personally. When I started, when I realized I wasn't going to go to, they had to not start law school, which I'd gotten accepted to and didn't know what I wanted to do. I started acting, and I did that for 3 years in technique and everything. And at that time, there was a play that I'm surprised more people don't know it. They made a film into it that wasn't very good, but the play was brilliant. I thought it was called I Never Sang for My Father. I don't know if you remember that one. A guy named Robert Anderson. And in the play, it's very much the playwright's story. It's about a middle-aged guy who's really hasn't fully lived his own life because he's been taking care of his kind of very large, imposing character of a father who was a big man of the world and is very overbearing and ages not well. And he's terrified of kind of disappointing his father. He's idealized him. He's never really lived his own life. And at the climax of the story, he basically says to his father that he's not going to stay living in Chicago. He's going to pursue a relationship in Los Angeles. And the father just has a complete meltdown, blow up, just clearly revealing he has no interest in letting the son live his own life. And it's the son's ability he's forcing him. He now sees, I can't stay here because he will crush me. Anyway, the scene is brilliant. And I went to hear the playwright talk about it after a production. And he said, this was very much my story. Someone asked him about this climactic last scene. And he said, it was very much my story. And, I was writing this thing and I got to it and I just couldn't write a good version of the scene. I didn't believe it. Nothing was there. And I realized the reason I couldn't write it was I had never had the scene in my real life. And I love this. I'm going to tell you more a little bit about it. But what I love this is it goes to what we started this conversation is that we define ourselves by stories.
Yes.
And that art has the capacity to get us to re-examine our stories. And what he had to re-examine because he was making art, because he was serving the story, because the story was more important than his self-protection. He realized that the story he had been living and was still living is that he couldn't face, he would be undone if he ever confronted his father. If he ever had to see whether his father really loved him or not, or whether he would sabotage him, even at the moment he was in love with someone at age 40. And he overcame the self-limiting story of his own life because he was serving the art. And he had the scene with his father and he basically transcribed it verbatim. And then and that became one of the most powerful scenes. And I love that story because it kind of speaks to what we can get from art. We need motivation. We need, to challenge these stories. It's not easy. But when we serve not the ego, when we serve the story we're telling, when we serve in getting to the deeper, what's the truth? He hadn't been able to face his own truth until he was engaged in this artistic process, and it encouraged and empowered him to confront the self-limiting story he'd been living.
And that's a really good place to wrap it up. So let me finish just by saying Dan Attias has been part of the golden age of television. He's still part of it. If there's good things being made, he'll be directing episodes of them. And if you check the credits as they run by your favorite programs, at least my favorite pieces of art on television, because that's what they are, like The Sopranos or The Fabulous Mrs. Maisel or Homeland or these other things, you're going to see Dan's name go by as the director. His book is Directing Great Television. It's out now. And I would encourage you to buy this if you have anything to do with making art, if you have anything to do with communication, if you have anything to do with trying to make or tell stories. And Dan, you've really written a terrific book. So I enjoyed the read incredibly. Thank you so much for writing it. I hope we can talk again sometime, and good luck with the directing job you're doing right now in New York, and safe home travels. Thank you for being on.
And Frank, thank you so much. It's an honor. So thank you.
Real pleasure talking with you.
Great.
Thanks, Dan.